Okay, I'm gonna admit to you, Miss Murphy, that when I found out your subject material and you were gonna be talking to the boys about the appropriateness of taking alcohol to a party, that, I was a little surprised, but then when I started thinking about, what we're doing and preparing them for life after, they transition, what a great skill, and I think it was awesome of you to see that that was something that they needed. And, I really enjoyed the lesson. I was a little scared about what kind of answers you might get.
So was I.
I'm sure you were. So in your opinion, what were the highlights of the lesson?
Well, I believe they were all interested in it, and because it was a subject matter probably that they've not had before, they were engaged as far as able to answer questions and connected, I think, with the lesson. And they've had to bring things to parties before, and so, it was something that they could connect with. I believe it's one of the good things about it.
Yeah, it was very authentic and relevant. I agree. What do you think, what concepts do you think that they actually mastered during your lesson? What do you think they took away from the lesson?
I hope what they took away was that you learn from your mistakes. And so it's okay to make a mistake, and hopefully the mistakes they make aren't life-altering, but that we do have to use the information that we have and make good decisions. And then if the decision you make isn't good, you learn from that as well. And that gives you more information for the next time you have to make a decision. So.
Okay. How did you decide on your method of delivery? I know you used one of the unique lessons, and you showed it on the smart board, and it had pictures, and it also had some things that could be read. How did you decide how you were going to carry out the lesson?
Well, I wanted to keep their attention, which is why I had it on the smart board. But I did the reading of the lesson, the story, because I knew that I could keep their attention better than them reading it silently. And some of their reading levels are not high enough. We had another version we could have used that was not as hard to read. So we had differentiated reading levels with that particular lesson.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought because of the subject, I wanted their attention to be focused on what I was saying.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's one of the reasons I read it, as opposed to, and that was the first time too. So in subsequent lessons, they could go back and do the reading themselves. But because that was an introduction and the material was so different, I felt like it was important to read that. And as I went along, then engaged them and reminded them, this is some specific examples of when something like that might have happened,
Mm-hmm.
To them, when they had to bring something to a party, and what do they do when they forget to go to the grocery store, and just to try again to make it relevant to their own situations.
Mm-hmm. And I think by doing it the way you did, sometimes you can see their reactions, and sometimes you learn a lot about them. Like I know you learned something about a young man and about something that goes on at his house because of this lesson, and so you could address that if you felt like you needed to.
And a lot of times when you have a lesson with subject matter that might be sensitive, depending on each family, you have to be careful too to keep the confidentiality of that family in mind, because sometimes you get information that maybe you didn't want, but then you got to be careful not to pry into things that aren't pertinent to the lesson. And so when they offer information, sometimes you have to steer them clear of too much information.
I thought the lesson was really great, but tell me, looking back on the lesson, do you see anything that you wish you'd have done differently, or if you do it again, that you would do differently?
Well, there was one of my students who did not seem as engaged as others, but I believe he was listening and taking it in. I think it was just because of his maturity level, he's not experienced some of those things before, yet. And so as far as, I'm not sure how to address any of that differently, because it was a situation where, he was listening, but as far as actually, opening his mouth and adding to the lesson, I don't know how he could do something different. You know, and then we have another one that shared some information that we did have to say, okay, that's, you know, bringing back around to the subject and not giving us too much about what goes on at home and that kind of thing. So I'm not sure what I can do different, you know, as far as to get one more engaged, but that's something I need to work on.
Do you think maybe asking him more frequent questions specifically, and maybe calling on him and saying, I'm fixing to give you some information, and I want you to think about an answer, and that way he's prompted?
That's a good idea.
I think you might could do that with him, and that way he knows that he needs.
He's up next.
He's up next, yeah, and it's gonna be his and only his, because I know that two of the other guys,
Yeah, big talkers.
they are, and they
enjoy.
don't, sometimes they don't give him enough time.
Yeah, that's true, that's true. And he's probably, taking in far more than they are because he's being quiet. You know, they're
Right.
waiting on, what's the next thing I can say, how can I get her
You
attention?
know, I've never thought of that. That's,
Mhm.
yeah, that is interesting. That's an interesting way to look at it. So, okay. Well, I thought it was great. All right, tell me how you, in a lesson like that, how do you, assess? And like at the end of that lesson, how would you decide this child got it, this child didn't, or, you know, how would you assess the students on a lesson like that?
Well, what I did that day, of course, was just ask them questions along and see if they could connect it to some, you know, some prior experience or, and I believe at the end of this lesson, I did say, if you have to bring something to a party, or, you know, how could you, because what happened in the story, the young man forgot to go to the grocery store, and so then I said, what do you do so that you don't forget something that you need to do, and that kind of thing, and so, that's one of the ways, you know, we tried to tie it up and say, okay, if you get up late, or if you, forget something, you know, how can you prevent that, as opposed to, you've already gotten up late, but, you know, we talked about doing a sticky note, or putting a note on your phone, and that kind of thing, and so, you know, I was trying to see if they could come up with ways that they could avoid that altogether, so they would have what they needed at the party and all. And then, and I also talked with them about, well, what do you, when you do make a mistake, then what do you do? Do you make that same mistake next time, or what can you do the next time? You have to remember to bring something.
Right.
So, you know, if they could give a good enough answer for that, you know, for their situation, then, you know, I felt like they had gotten it.
I like that. I like the way I like that you look at assessment a little bit differently than we do in a typical classroom. It's not always numerical.
That's right.
And especially with what your goal is here, of preparing them for transitioning out into the real world. So, thank you so much for letting me come today.
You come anytime.
And I really enjoyed it, and I look forward to seeing more lessons.
Good, thank you.
Thank you. Hallelujah.